Hello, my name is Ken Hahn. This is my wife Jeannie. Today we're going to teach you how to make my grandmother Mildred Bartow's apple pie. During her lifetime, that apple pie was considered to be the gold standard for everybody in the family and friends and neighbors as well. It had the greatest combination of tartness, sweetness, excellent feel in the mouth, and a crust that was to die for. You could look sharply at that crust and it would start to flake. It was just that good. Now, over the years, everybody in the family has tried to make her apple pie. I consider myself the judge, and I can tell you nobody's come too close. Even I can't do it that well. But one thing I have done is figured out her crust, or at least a modern version of it using mechanical equipment instead of hand mixing. So today we're going to look at the crust, because the crust has to sit for 24 hours before we can do much with it. So the first thing you don't want to do is use one of these things. This thing you should throw away. Because if you go to any pie recipe, they say for the crust, take your flour, your salt, your sugar, combine it, put the Crisco or lard in it, and then take this thing and start cutting it, and cut it into little pieces about the size of peas, then put in the water and mix it up. And if you do, and you're really careful, you'll end up with a crust that may be 1 or 2 steps above mediocre. That's as good as it gets. Now, how Grandma did it, nobody has ever figured out. But when you take her recipe, it doesn't work the same way. So I'm going to show you a way I've found to make that crust, which is almost as good as she did. You start out with shortening. That's 2 cups of shortening. Then you put in 4 cups of a mixture of flour, salt, and sugar. There's 596 grams or 4 cups of flour, a teaspoon and a half of salt, and a tablespoon and a third, or a tablespoon and a teaspoon, if you will, of sugar. Now, instead of cutting this with one of these devices, you put it on your mixer, and you take a whisk, a wire whisk. I'll bet nobody of you have ever used a wire whisk to make a pie crust. Now, if you turn this on very hard, you're going to spray flour all over the place, so don't do that. Kind of pulse it a little bit, and if you watch close, you'll notice that the consistency of the flour starts to change. It stops being so puffy and powdery, and the Crisco starts to disperse throughout it. Now what I'll do is lift this a little bit so you can see that you're getting sort of a pasty consistency. So we'll keep doing that. And we'll sort of work there's still a little bit of flour loose on the edges. We want to work that in. Now you'll notice that the color of the flour is changing because it's being wet out by the Crisco. So what I'm going to do now, there's a little bit of Crisco trapped in the mixer here. So we want to get this all mixed together. So at this point, we've still got a flour base with some Crisco finely dispersed by the whisk through it. Now this is where it gets interesting. Turn this back on. You can increase the speed a little bit now. And notice the consistency of this mix is changing. It's getting kind of lumpy. And in a few seconds of higher mixing, all of the flour has disappeared. And you have what a chemist would refer to as a glump. See, it's a paste now. It's no longer flour with some Crisco pieces dispersed through it. Mix this up a little bit more. Give it just a little bit more mixing. And I have what a physical chemist would refer to as a phase inversion. When we started, we had flour with Crisco dispersed in it. And by working the Crisco with this whisk, what we've done, the Crisco has become the continuous phase with the flour mixed in it. Now if you think about flour as being fine fibers of material, when you wet them, they get very, very swollen and tangled. That's why if you come from a small country town, you might have gone to a school where the kids made glue out of flour and water. And believe me, glue doesn't make a particularly attractive pie crust. So what we've done here, we've taken that a step further, and now the continuous phase of this is actually the Crisco with the flour dispersed in it. So you can think about the individual fibers of flour as being individually coated with shortening. They're lubricated. They can't stick together. You could beat this thing for 20 minutes and it's not going to get tough. You would just make it a little bit smoother, if anything. Now, you look at this and you say, well, that kind of looks like pie crust. I'll bet I could go ahead and just roll that out. And if you do, you'll make something so smooth that you can never pick it up. It'll just fall apart. It has to have some water in it. But now, when the water goes in, it's going to get into the individual fibers. It's not going to be tangling them up. So now what we do is we switch over to a dough hook, which is where most people would probably start. But this is for the finishing touch. So what we'll do, put this in, then we take our water, 3/4 of a cup, about 175 grams, and you just start nursing the water into this. Now you would think that when you did that, this would get incredibly thin and runny and not make a good crust. But that's not true, because what's going to happen is, as this works, the water is going to imbibe into the mix, and there. And it's going to be a nice doughy consistency. Then what we'll want to do is let this sit overnight in the refrigerator, and slowly, slowly the water is going to work its way into the individual fibers. Let's keep this working a little while. And again, you can beat on this to your heart's content. You're not going to make this into any kind of a very tough pastry at all. It's just going to be a nice smooth dough. You can see it looked kind of runny at first, but now it's getting back to where it was to begin with. So let's lift this up and turn it over. A little bit messier than the way you've probably always learned how to make crust, but the results will be very much worth it. Just give that another 20 or 30 seconds of mixing. Now while that's mixing, we'll prepare a sheet of okay, the pie crust is finished. Just a matter now of getting it out. You can see how much softer and tenderer this is than a normal pie crust would be. Make a loaf out of it. Okay. Cut off this sheet. The sides, and to make sure it doesn't leak out at all, we'll do another sheet crossways. Just give it a little bit of shaping action here. And into the refrigerator until tomorrow. Okay, our crust is now ready to be rolled out. This dough will be cut into 2 pieces, and we'll get it into the pie plate, and then we'll start putting in the filling. The first thing I want to mention though is the apples. A good apple pie will have at least 3 different kinds of apples in it. In this case, we're using Honeycrisp, which is kind of a tangy and sweet apple, Gala, which is full and robust, and we're using Granny Smith, which is a very tart apple. And those 3 give you a nice, robust flavor. What you do not want to do, under any circumstances, is use a canned pie filling, because it'll be made from 1 apple, and you just have no latitude in terms of building a really good apple pie filling. This is about 12 apples, 4 of these, 5 of these, and 3 of these, and they're mixed up together. You'll notice the slice size is nice so it can be cooked through thoroughly, but it won't turn mushy. Okay, the first thing we do then, I use Pam butter spray because I like a little extra butter flavor. The more interest we can generate for your palate, the better this is going to be. So, we're now ready for the base of the pie, which is the bottom crust. Have some flour nicely on there. And we take half of this. Notice how tender this is. You will not get any other procedure that gives you this kind of tenderness on a pie crust. If this was any more tender, you wouldn't have to roll it out. You just put it down and it would spread all by itself. But we will go ahead and roll it a little bit. A little more flour on top. Then we work it out. A little bit more flour. And then you hardly have to push this at all. Notice how this baby just rolls out here. Just keep working it to maintain some semblance of a circle. And like any other pie crust, you want to get it reasonably uniform in thickness. Now, one thing that is a little bit tricky with this, because this pie crust is so tender, it's a little bit hard to pick up. If you just grab one side and pick it up, you'll just tear it. So we use the other approach, which is to roll it. And it goes over here. And then at this point, Jeannie will take over. And she will start assembling the pie.
So the first thing I do is just make sure it fits in nicely, and then if there's any excess, I just trim it off and use that if I need to patch any other areas, which normally you don't need to do that. And you can see how tender it is. It's so easy to work with. Okay, so right here I might get some water and just dab a little bit here because it needs to overlap here just a little bit more. So I'll just take this and attach it so that I have a wider lip here for this section. Then the first thing is I put in the amounts.
Yeah, this is a mixture of 2½ cups of sugar and a cup of white flour. That gives you some thickening because the apples are going to generate a whole bunch of juice. And the sugar, oh, you know why you've got sugar in there.
Then the apples.
And then you put in about half of the apples.
We like to have our pies really nice and thick, and they're like little mountains of apples. So that's about half.
Okay, then another 3/4 cup. Each of these is 3/4 cup of the sugar and flour mix. And again, that's 2½ cups of sugar and a cup of flour, and just mix it up really well.
So you have the nice base and then the apples and some more of the mixture.
Then the next thing is 1 teaspoon of cinnamon sprinkled all over the surface. Apples and cinnamon are always a good combination. Then the rest of the apples go in, if you can get them all heaped up on there. But you really want to have lots of apples in your pie. You're going to a lot of trouble to make this, and it would just be an awful shame not to have a complete whole pie. I sometimes peel a few too many because I'd rather have a few left over than have the pie not clear full. Okay, the next thing on the agenda is a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. A little bit of salt in a pie brings out the flavor, pulls the other flavors together. Good thing to do.
Just a touch.
And then another 3/4 of a cup of the sugar and flour mix. You want to have the apples sandwiched between all kinds of sugar and some flour for thickening. And then 1 1/4 teaspoons of cinnamon. And then butter. A full stick of butter, that's 1/4 pound, cut into pads. Now just a word about that. You remember how we put the crust together? And I said we only used 2 cups of shortening. Many pie recipes call for 3 cups, but with the procedure we use, you don't really need 3 cups. 2 is plenty. Now that's very good because that makes you feel less guilty about putting all this butter on top of the pie. Because the butter is a bit rich, but you've got less Crisco, so it all works out really well. Now, Grandma Bartow used her own butter, had a butter churn, and she made her own butter. And of course, bought butter is not going to be quite that good. And that's probably one of the reasons our pies aren't quite up to the standards of hers. Okay, now we have to roll out the top crust. And that's exactly like the bottom one. Start with some flour.
The top crust is just a nice finish for the pie. It actually seals in the pie all the juices and the butter, unlike custard pies where you don't really need that. But with a fruit filling, it's perfect to have both upper and bottom crust.
You spread it out part way. You could almost do the whole thing without a rolling pin if you wanted to. Get a little flour all over it. And then, again, roll it nicely into a circle.
Nice and large round circles so it overlaps all of this mountain of apples.
There's a delicate balance between making it too thin and making it not big enough. So we'll take a shot at coming somewhere in the middle on this. Does that look big enough to you, Jeannie?
I think so. I think it'll work.
Okay. Okay, this is the tricky part now.
What I'm doing is just dabbing a little bit of water around so that when we put the top crust on top, I press and adhere that.
Okay, let's see what we can do here. Is that over far enough? No. I'll hold it there.
It's very tender, so it's easy and sometimes not as easy. Perfect. I think that'll work. Now what I do is just sort of press a little bit around to get that situated. Now this side over here, I'm going to have to trim and add a little bit there. So I'm trimming off some of the overlap from this side here. And I'm just going to attach it up here so the apples, all the juice from the apples when they're cooking out won't come out, and they'll stay sealed into the pie. So with this crust, you can see how tender it is. You can do this, just add on a little section here. Then you have it nicely overlapped all the way around. Then I'm just evening it out to do the little fluted edge crust. So I'm just taking some of this extra around and around here. You can see how easy and soft this crust is. I'm finishing trimming this off. And then now I've got it more or less evenly around. And what I want to do is press the two together and turn it underneath on itself. So we've got the two layers here, the bottom crust, the top crust, and I'm little squeezing it together, putting it underneath the rim of the pie plate. This is almost the last portion. So I'm just squeezing it together just so that it will stay sealed. And now I just do a little decorative thing where I take the thumb and this finger and this and just flute around to give it a little nice design. This is the way Grandma Bartow fluted the pie, and so I followed her directions precisely. So it could be just like hers, but it never quite was. So this will just about finish the little fluted pie edge. And this is the part of the pie that people, sometimes if they don't like crust, won't eat. But with this pie, you'll like it so much you'll eat the crust. Then the next thing is just cut some little vents in the top to let the steam out. And if you want to be fancy, here's where you could scroll A for apple or whatever like that. But I just like the little V's. That works perfectly.
Got a little bit of sugar, just in case we ran a little bit short inside. We like to put a little bit of sugar on top of the crust. It adds a little bit of a nice look to it after it's baked too.
Just sprinkle a little bit around.
Now what you don't want, when a pie bakes this long, it is possible for that nice fluted outside part to get too brown. So we protect it with a double thickness of aluminum foil. It needs to be a little over 3 feet long to fit all around. We tried using the commercial little taps, but this is such a tender crust that if you do that, it's likely to break the whole thing off when you remove it.
And this is easy to do. You have this folded foil, and then you just crimp it a bit just to keep it on there. It protects it. And you keep that on except for the last 15 to 20 minutes. And then you want to take it off so that the crust edge then can brown as well as the regular part of the pie.
Now, despite our best efforts, sometimes these pies leak a little bit because they really are full. And if it starts to leak, you don't want to mess in the bottom of your oven. So we put a cookie sheet lined with aluminum foil underneath, and that will catch anything that might drip out.
And then I keep the section here where I connected it near the front so that after an hour I can open the oven and easily just pull that off.
Okay, so we set the oven at 375 Fahrenheit for 1 hour. And in 1 hour we'll remove the foil and then finish baking. Okay. At this point, the pie has baked for an hour, and now it's time to take the foil off of the outer rim and let the crust bake at an equal rate with the rest of the crust. It's really starting to smell good. You can see it's already starting to be a little bit golden. So now it goes back in for about 20 minutes, and we'll see where we are. It might take another 10 minutes after that, but I don't know. It's starting to look like a nice golden crust already. So the pie is finished at this point. We'll take a look at it. You'll notice that it's a beautiful golden brown. The crust is not too dark, so Jeannie's going to pick it up and take it up onto the shelf. And it was a successful sealing job because there was no leakage, or very little leakage, onto the oil on the below. So now we just sit there and watch it cool off, and as soon as it cools off enough, we'll cut a piece out and take a taste and see how good it might be. Now, we don't think she told us just everything that she did in that pie, but it still was awfully good. And we're really, really happy that we've had the opportunity to share this with you. Now, the scraps I always throw away. Jeannie likes to keep them because she thinks she'll do something with them. After a week or two, she throws them away too, but they get to live a little longer.
I'm going to make something out of this.
Right.
Prove you wrong. Here they are. I'm going to make Judy's famous thumbprint cookies. So if you want to use those wonderful, soft, tender scraps of dough, you can just roll out the balance of what was left and cut little round circles. Cut them out with your little teeny biscuit cutter and fill them with jams or jellies, strawberry preserves, or whatever you want. And then bake them and they'll be delicious. They're known as Judy M's thumbprint cookies.